Hey guys, it's Meredith. I just wanted to make a quick review video on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, a concept that I struggled with for a long time. So a few concepts. Number one, I think it is helpful to sort of think of the right side of the x-axis as the lungs and the left side of the x-axis as the body. So here's the axis, and remember, here on the left side, we're in the lower PO2, and on the right side, we're the higher PO2. So the higher PO2 is the lungs, and the lower PO2 is the body. Another important point is that hemoglobin will bind to oxygen, even if your affinity to hold on to it is a little bit decreased. So you will get your oxygen on your hemoglobin. So now let's talk about the curve, and more like moving along the curve, because that's the important part to understand. So again, here's the axis, and remember, on the x-axis, you have the left side with the lower PO2 and the right side with the higher PO2. Right side is going to be lungs, left side is going to be body. So like I said, x-axis is the PaO2, and then the y-axis is going to be the SaO2, which is the saturation. And then remember, you kind of have this sigmoidal curve because you don't want to bind oxygen at first, then you bind up a lot, and then you sort of are fully saturated. All right, so let's start in the lungs, where your PO2 is 100, and that's going to correspond to an oxygen saturation of 100%, give or take. Now forgive my bad drawing. Your PO2 of 30 is more over to the right, more here, around right there. And this sort of marker I had earlier is going to be a much lower partial pressure. Another important point on this graph is where the partial pressure is 60, because in a healthy human, that generally corresponds to a saturation of about 90%. So you can see that anywhere from 60 to 100, you're going to be 90 to 100%. So that change in PO2 doesn't make a big change in saturation. But if we keep going down, say to a PO2 of 30, then our saturation now drops to 50 because we've gotten onto the steep part of the curve. So by going from a PO2 in the lungs of 100 to a PO2 in the body of 30, we can say we've dropped off 50% of our oxygen. So now let's talk about that right shifted curve. So we shift the curve to the right, and there's not like much difference on the bottom or the top of the curve. The main difference is in that steep part of the curve. So again, this is called the right shift of the curve. And you can see that when you're in the lungs, over here on the right side of the axis where the PO2 is around 100, then your oxygen saturation, because that's the flat part of the curve, is still ranging from like the high 80s to the 100%. So not much change there. However, if we go into the tissues, meaning down to this PO2 of around 30, then we get an oxygen saturation on this curve of say 30%. Now that means that we dropped off 100 to 30, about 70% of our oxygen, so significantly more drop off than before. So the whole point of this shift is to facilitate going from the lungs to the body and dropping off oxygen. And just to review, the things that do that are the increase in the protons, the increase in the carbon dioxide production. Both of these things lead to a decrease in pH, so be sure to know that. There's also an increase in temperature can cause this, and then the increase in that molecule 2,3-DPG. All right, so I know that was a lot, and that's a crazy messy slide, so I'm just going to do a quick review, basically, of the same thing, just one more time. All right, here's the deal. Right side of the graph is going to be lungs, left side is going to be body, okay? Where you start is going to be your lungs, where you want to be 100%. Then you're going to be able to go down the curve through the body, dropping off oxygen, okay? So on the y-axis, we can measure that the delta oxygen saturation is how much oxygen you dropped off to the tissues, okay? Then you can also go from the body, where you were low PO2, back to the lungs where you were high PO2, and now you pick up oxygen and you're going to saturate 100%. And this goes so on and so on and so on. All right, so what if we shift the curve to the right? Remember, now when you're at the same PO2, you'll have a lower SO2, meaning you'll drop off more oxygen to the tissues. This is clinically relevant in exercise or when you're sick and your body has higher rate of metabolism, thereby needing more oxygen. Now don't forget that the curve can also shift to the left. Remember what this means. This means that you will actually drop off less oxygen to the tissues because you're going to have a higher affinity for holding on to oxygen. An example of clinical relevance here is carbon monoxide, which increases affinity and causes a left shift. All right, one more point I want to make. The point of oxygen is to get to the tissues so that your tissues can use the oxygen for cellular metabolism. So if you start with a sat of 100%, and then when you get to the tissues, you end up with a sat of 75%, that's just a 25% drop off of your oxygen. But if you start with a sat of a 90% lower, but you get to 50% in the tissues, then you've dropped off 40% of your oxygen. Now, these are just made up numbers, but my point here is that right shifting, decreasing the affinity for oxygen so that you drop off more in the tissues is going to be beneficial when your body needs it. And just again, to remind you, this happens in exercise, this happens when you're sick, okay? That's what increases the protons, increases the CO2, increases your temperature, okay? And it also happens in patients that live in high altitude or in those that have chronic hypoxemia. And that is by way of increasing the molecule 2,3-DPG, which helps drop off oxygen in the tissues. Remember, everything just goes in the opposite direction to shift to the left, which makes oxygen stay bound to the hemoglobin. So I know I really said that about 1,000,000 times, and you're probably tired of me saying it, but I just want to make sure you guys understand because that was something I struggled with when I was a medical student. So that's all I have for today. Please feel free to email me, mkgreer@emory.edu. We really enjoyed working with you guys, and we'll be excited to see you back in February for the pulmonary block. Good luck on your exam.